Okay, so we're here today to talk about the latest greenhouse gas projections from the EPA. Our projections are from 2024 out to 2055. So to give you an overview of today's presentation, first of all, I'll take you through the two projected scenarios that we use for this report. Then we'll talk about the key messages. I'll go on to give a bit more detail about the compliance with our national target that Emer mentioned earlier on. Then we'll talk about compliance with our EU targets. And then Tomás will come on at that point and go through some more detailed sectoral analysis of the projections. So the EPA is the competent authority responsible for developing, preparing and publishing the projections of greenhouse gas emissions. And we do this for national, EU and UN reporting requirements. We gather information for the projections from a number of key partners and data providers. I'm not going to go through them all, they're listed here, but I'd like to take the opportunity to say thank you for the full engagement that we had for the preparation of these projections. So we provide the projections with two scenarios, the with existing measures scenario and the with additional measures scenario. And it's important to note really that for each round of these projections, which we update annually, we reevaluate the assumptions. So we start, discussing these assumptions from around September, completed in November of each year. So at the time of the preparation of these projections, the Climate Action Plan 2024 was the latest climate plan published. So to describe the with existing measures scenario, first of all, these are measures that are committed to by government. And this scenario represents what the emissions trajectory is likely to be based on implemented policies. So there's a large degree of certainty around the with existing measures scenario. The measures, as I said, they're committed to by government and they're underpinned by either legal arrangements, agreements, there could be financial resources in place, human resources in place and committed to, or official government decisions. Then the second scenario is the with additional measures scenario. And this includes the with existing measures plus additional measures that are at the planned stage. And these are outlined in the government plans, for example, in the Climate Action Plan. The with additional measures to be included in this scenario, the plans must have a realistic chance of implementation, and we need to have enough information in relation to the planned policy so we can use it in our modelling. So to give an overview of the key messages in our report this year. So in relation to our national target of a 51% reduction, Ireland is projected to achieve a reduction of up to 23% in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And in order to achieve this 23% reduction, it requires full implementation of a wide range of policies and plans across all sectors. And in addition, these policies and plans must deliver the savings, the anticipated or intended savings. In terms of our carbon budgets then, the first and second carbon budgets are projected to be exceeded across almost all sectors, and we're on a trajectory to exceed the national sectoral emission ceilings. In relation to the EU effort sharing regulation then, which has a 42% reduction target by 2030 based on 2005 baseline, we project that a maximum of 22% of reduction can be achieved. And total emissions from the land sector are projected to increase by up to 95%, and we're very unlikely to meet our European commitments in this area. So this figure here shows our performance against our national targets. So the grey line in the figure is the trajectory to meet our national target of a 51% emissions reduction by 2030. And that will require us to achieve emissions of 32 million tonnes by 2030. The orange line here in the graph is our with existing measure policies, and that shows us that emissions will reduce by 9% by 2030. The blue line then is our with additional measures scenario, and that's showing us that the policies could reduce emissions by 23% by 2030. So you can see here, even in the best case scenario, there's a large distance to target. This table here now gives a bit more information around our sectoral ceiling assessment, and this is an assessment for the with additional measures scenario. So first of all, if we look at the 2021 to 2025 period, we have our sectoral ceilings listed, and then we have our projected emissions for this period. And we can see here that we're projecting that we will either be under or at our sectoral ceiling for a number of sectors, including electricity, buildings, so that's residential and commercial and public service buildings, and also for the sector other. Moving to 2026 to 2030 then, at this point, we're only projecting that the sectoral emission ceiling will be met for the sector other. And the sector other is a combination of waste, F-gases, and petroleum refining. So there's quite a bit in this figure, so I'll take you through it, and it describes our projected compliance with our carbon budgets. So first of all, the purple columns are our inventory. So this is the EPA published inventory up to 2023. And then the projections begin in 2024. And you can see again, there's the orange line, which is our with existing measures projection, and the blue line are additional measures projection. So we have illustrated here our carbon budgets. So you can see them from 2021 to 25, 26 to 30, and 31 to 35. And just for the sake of showing it on a figure, it's just we have annualized the budgets across those years. So looking then at our performance against the budget, we can see here that for 21 to 25, in the with existing measure scenario, we're above the carbon budget, and we're just at it here for WAM. But in total, across the period, we exceed the carbon budget by between 8 and 12 million tonnes. It's an obligation under the Climate Act that where there is an exceedance of one carbon budget, that this exceedance is carried on to the next carbon budget. And this is illustrated here in these lines. So the dark blue line here shows where our carbon budget reduces to in the WAM scenario, and the pink line here shows where it reduces to in the with existing measures scenario. So for carbon budget 2 then, and considering that carryover, we are projected that the carbon budget will be exceeded by between 77 and 114 million tonnes by the end of 2030. And you can see then the exceedance is carried over again into the next budget period with even further distance to target at that point. So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we re-evaluate our WEM and WAM input assumptions each year. So this table shows a summary of where we're at the moment with the WAM projections in relation to the Climate Action Plan targets for some of the key input assumptions. So first of all then, for our renewable energy, in relation to onshore wind, offshore wind and solar, our projections reach a trajectory of 7.1 gigawatts, 2.7 gigawatts and 6.3 gigawatts by 2030. And overall, that achieves a RES-E of 68% by 2030. So this is in comparison to a RES-E of 80%, which is planned in Climate Action Plan 2024. Looking at electric vehicle numbers then, the Climate Action 2024 target is 945,000 total EVs by 2030. And we have based our projections on the assumption that 640,000 will be on the roads by 2030 in our WAM scenario. Looking at biomethane then, the target is 5.7 terawatt hours in place by 2030. In our WAM scenario, we have reached 4.3 terawatt hours by 2030, and that's based on the latest information in relation to what's possible to be achieved by 2030 given the current pipeline. In relation to district heating then, the cap target is 2.7 terawatt hours by 2030, but our model by 2030 achieves 0.21 terawatt hours by 2030. So it's quite a difference there between the two. And also, which is the same as last year's projections, we still do not include the diversification measure in agriculture. So if you add up all of the, in addition to those, there are unallocated savings in the Climate Action Plan of 5.25 million tonnes annually, or 26 million tonnes in total, and that's spread across 2026 to 2030. And because they are not allocated, we can't allocate them to a particular sector. Therefore, we cannot project emissions reductions based on these savings. So in total, with the unallocated savings and the WAM scenario that we have in place, if you were to add that back in, it would be approximately an additional abatement of 13 million tonnes. So I'm going to move on now to talking about our projected emissions under the effort sharing regulation. So the effort sharing regulation covers the sectors transport, buildings, so that's how we heat our buildings, waste and small industry. And these are sectors that are not included in the EU ETS scheme. So again, I'll take you through this figure. First of all, here we have this grey line, and this is our target regarding our EU target. So Ireland has been given an ambition of 42% to achieve a 42% reduction on our 2005 baseline by 2030. And that will mean we must achieve emissions of almost 28 million tonnes CO2 equivalent. And to reach that, we're given an annual emission allocation for each year between 2021 and 2030, and that's demonstrated in the grey line. But we don't have to achieve this annual emission allocation in order to achieve compliance. There are two flexibilities that are available to Ireland to be used under the effort sharing regulation. So there's an ETS flexibility, and that's demonstrated here in the purple dots. And there's also a LULUCF flexibility. The LULUCF flexibility we project will only be available to us from 2021 to 2025. So you can see that those flexibilities allow us to emit more, but still comply. Then we have our with existing measures line and our with additional measures line. And you can see here that even given the use of flexibilities, we're still quite a distance away from our target. So in the worst case scenario then, where we are forecasting our with existing measures scenario, plus the use of the ETS flexibility, we're still 49 million tonnes above our target. And then in the best case scenario, where we're able to avail of both flexibilities, ETS and LULUCF, we are still 15 million tonnes above our target, and that's including the WAM emissions. So overall then, in relation to our EU ESR compliance, our target is a 42% reduction compared to 2005. Our projections show that our WEM policies will only reduce emissions by 10% by 2030. Our WAM scenario then, if it's fully implemented, those policies and measures could deliver a 22% emissions reduction by 2030. As in previous years, two sectors, agriculture and transport, dominate the emissions in the effort sharing regulation. So together, they're 75% of our emissions in 2030. If we use our available flexibilities, and the use of flexibilities is a decision for central government, we could achieve compliance of between 13 and achieve reductions of between 13 and 26% in relation to that 42% reduction target. And our projections are showing that without the use of flexibilities, our ESR emissions will exceed our allocation by between 48 and 68 million tonnes by 2030. So that is the overview in relation to compliance. I'm going to hand over to Tomás now to discuss a bit our sectors in a bit more detail.
So good afternoon. Today I'll be presenting the sectoral summaries from our report launched yesterday. So to begin with agriculture, which is our largest national source of emissions at 38% of our emissions in 2023. Under WEM, the projections for emissions to remain relatively static out to 2030, so rising by 1% to bring us to 21.6 million tonnes in 2030. This increase is largely being driven by dairy cow numbers increasing out to 2030, which has been partially offset by a projected decrease in non-dairy cattle. However, there will also be increases projected for sheep, pig and poultry populations, along with increased fertilizer use by 2030. Under WAM, the projections for emissions to decrease by 16% to bring us to 18 million tonnes in 2030. This includes a whole suite of additional measures, such as all slurry stores for cattle and pig to be covered by 2027, including caps for national fertiliser sales of nitrogen fertilisers of 300,000 tonnes by 2030. As per last year, diversification measures with a potential abatement of 1.5 million tonnes of CO2 equivalents have not been included in these projections because at present the implementation pathway for diversification in agriculture is still unavailable. Moving on to transport, which is the second largest source of national emissions, which would have been 22% in 2023. Under WEM, these emissions are projected to decrease by 9%, bringing us to 11.2 million tonnes in 2030. Last year, we would have been projecting actually minus 5%, a 5% decrease in these emissions. And the improvement that we're seeing here is because a particular measure, namely the 10% of biofuels in petrol and 20% of biofuels in diesel have gone from an additional measure to an implemented measure, and it's now included in our WEM, hence the 9% decrease projected with this year's projections. Under WAM, emissions are projected to decrease by 21%, bringing us to 9.7 million tonnes in 2030. Again, this has been driven by an uptake of EVs by 2030 of around 640,000 EVs expected to be on the road by then, of which around 610,000 will be private cars and 31,000 commercial vehicles. In addition, will also be a projected increase of daily public transport journeys by 2030 of 130%. So these are these sort of additional measures that we're seeing, along with a few others, in terms of the avoid shift, to bring our transport emissions down, ideally to 21%. In terms of the energy sector, which now represents around 14% of our national emissions, we are projecting a decrease of 59% to bring us to 4.4 million tonnes in 2030. Again, that's a slight improvement on last year's projection of 57%. And this has largely been driven by the reevaluation of input assumptions relating to the renewable share out to 2030, which at the present under WEM is 60%. In addition to the projected increase in interconnection as well out by 2030. So under WEM, this is expected to be 19%. For WAM, we're projecting a decrease of 68%, bringing us to 3.4 million tonnes in 2030. And again, last year, we would have been projecting a 62% decrease in emissions under WAM. And again, this is largely based on the reevaluation of input assumptions based on the renewable share, 68.3%. For residential emissions, which now represent 10% of our national emissions in 2023, and these are largely emissions relating to fuel combustion to heat our homes and heat our water. So under WEM, we're projecting a decrease of 19% to bring us to 5.7 million tonnes in 2030. This is again has been driven by the installation of heat pumps in both existing and new dwellings, around 81,000 by 2030 under the WEM scenario, in addition to the effective ban on gas boilers from this year onwards in new dwellings. Under WAM, we're projecting a 22% decrease in emissions to bring us to 5.4 million tonnes in 2030. And again, this is an expansion of additional measures, including 430,000 heat pumps in both existing and new dwellings, as well as the increased rollout of residential efficiency programs, which will involve the upgrading of homes and retrofits to bring effectively a cost optimal equivalent of a BER rating of B2 to 500,000 dwellings by 2030 to achieve that 22% reduction in emissions. Onto industry. So within industry, it's typically comprised of two main components. So manufacturing combustion, which is largely sort of the heat needed for industry to occur. So something like the cement kilns, as an example, in the production of cement and the combustion of those fuels for those kilns. And also within the industry sector, we have these process-based emissions, which depending on the particular industry, whether it's the mineral industry or the chemical industry, we also have sort of particular processes, chemical processes that produce emissions too. But they're both small sectors. So within manufacturing combustion, that represents around 8% of our national emissions in 2023. And at present, we're projecting a decrease of 13% to bring us to 4.1 million tonnes in 2030. And this scenario is on the current implemented suite of energy efficient programs that are being rolled out by organizations like the SEI. So the Large Industry Program, the Accelerated Capital Allowances Program, and the Excellence in Energy Efficiency and Design Program, the EXCEED program, across this particular sector, to bring about that 13% decrease by 2030. Under WAM, we're projecting a 19% decrease to bring us to 3.8 million tonnes with combustion emissions by 2030. And that's in addition to any of those programs that I've just mentioned, the rollout of 4.3 terawatt hours of biomethane, which will displace the use of natural gas in this sector for combustion, which will also be split. That rollout in biomethane will also be split with the sort of commercial and public sector area that I'll be talking to in another 2 slides. In terms of process-based emissions, which in Ireland, it largely represents the mineral industry, or more specifically the cement industry. There is no WAM, there is only WEM. And at the moment, our WEM projection is for a 3% decrease in 2030. And given that these process emissions are largely dominated by the cement sector, it's based on the growth projection that we have for that particular sector of at present 1.4% per annum out to 2035, with a national maximum capacity of 4.7 million tonnes of cement to be produced in 2035. So based on that trajectory, this is where we get our 3% reduction in emissions in 2030. For commercial and public services, so this largely represents the heating needed for both space and water across public sector buildings, so government buildings, hospitals, schools, etc. Now, at present, we're projecting a decrease of 10% of emissions to bring us to 1.4 million tonnes in 2030. And again, similar to the industrial sector, it assumes an implementation of a range of different energy efficiency programs, such as the Support Scheme for Renewable Heat and the Public Sector Capital Exemplar programs. Under WAM, we're projecting a decrease of 36% to bring us to 1.6 million tonnes in 2030. And as mentioned, part of that is the rollout of the 4.3 terawatt hours of biomethane, so displace natural gas and the need for heating from natural gas in this sector, in addition to 0.214 terawatt hours of district heat that could be applied to this particular sector in 2030, again to bring about that WAM projected decrease of emissions of 36%. Under the land use and land use change and forestry sector, or LULUCF, which at present represents 6.6% of our national emissions in 2023, there is a projected increase in emissions out to 2030 of 95% to bring this sector to 7.8 million tonnes in 2030. This is largely due to the projected forest harvesting, given the current sort of aging forestry estate that we have. And this scenario also assumes an afforestation rate consistent with current practice of around 2,000 hectares per annum. Under WAM, this increase will be 42% out to 2030 to bring us to 3.4 million tonnes. And this assumes a suite of additional measures largely relating to afforestry, such as increasing afforestry rates to 8,000 hectares per annum from 2026 onwards, extended forestry rotation as outlined in the Climate Action Plan 2024, and meeting agroforestry targets of 2,000 hectares as also outlined in the CAP. To switch quickly to compliance, based on our current target under the LULUCF regulation of 3.4 million tonnes, under WEM, we're projecting this target to be exceeded by 4.4 million tonnes in 2030, and under WAM, it should be exceeded by 2.1 million tonnes by 2030. Just to state, it's important to note that these numbers are subject to revision. So as an example, this year in 2025, that national target of 0.626 million tonnes below the 2016 to 2018 average, there is currently an ongoing in-depth review by the Commission of these data across Europe based on inventories submitted in March this year. That target would be updated based on the latest information in those inventories. Similarly, in 2027, there will be another in-depth review, and that review will outline annual targets from 26 to 2030 for the LULUCF sector. whereby based on the average of 2021 to 23 and a linear trajectory out to 2030, emissions in the sector will also have to meet that linear trajectory. But again, because the starting point of that trajectory is based on an average, again, based on that in-depth review, those annual compliance targets for LULUCF will also be revised. And then finally, in 2032, there will be a full in-depth review and compliance check, again, with a revision to the target, with a revision to those annual targets from 26 to 2030. So it just highlights that this is our current understanding, but this will be subject to change as those in-depth reviews and compliance checks roll out. Okay, so just to close and recap on the key messages. Ireland is projected to achieve a reduction of up to 23% in total greenhouse gases by 2030, compared to our national target of 51%. To achieve a reduction of 23% will require full implementation of a wide range of policies and plans across all sectors. Our first carbon budget and second carbon budget are projected to be exceeded, with all sectors on a trajectory to exceed their national sector emission ceilings for 2030. Ireland will not meet its EU effort sharing regulation target of 42% reduction by 2030. Instead, a maximum reduction of 22% is projected. And total emissions from the land sector are projected to increase by up to 95%. And it is also unlikely we will meet our European commitments in this sector. Okay, so thank you very much.